The first thing Elias Turner saw at the gate of his new cabin wasn't the land he thought he had bought for 12 cents. It was a body. The evening sun cast long shadows across the prairie, turning the grass into a sea of bronze. The wooden gate of the cabin groaned faintly in the wind. And there, hung from the overhead beam, swayed a figure so large Elias had to blink to make sure his eyes weren't lying to him. It wasn't a man. It was a woman. An Apache girl, taller and broader than any man Elias had ever known. Her long legs nearly touched the ground, even as the rope choked her neck. Dust and blood smeared across her face. Her eyes, half open, flickered like dying embers searching desperately for breath. Elias froze in the saddle. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the rope and the restless snort of his tired horse. He had thought himself hardened. Years on the trail, battles fought and lost, lonely nights under cold stars. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. The cabin he had bought for 12 cents was no home. It was a warning. His hand slid instinctively to the knife at his belt. The blade flashed once in the amber light, slicing the rope clean. The girl's body fell heavy, crashing into the dirt with the force of a tree brought down by storm. Elias staggered back, knees buckling under the weight of what he had just done. She lay there, chest heaving in broken rhythm, her throat raw from the burn of the rope. Her body, though beaten, carried the raw power of a warrior. Elias knelt beside her, tearing a strip from his worn shirt, wrapping it around her neck with trembling hands. He didn't know why, only that letting her die here, like an animal displayed at a gate, would make him less of a man than he already feared he had become. Her lips cracked open. A sound, not quite words, escaped. Her dark eyes met his, burning with both fury and a plea for life. Elias reached for the canteen at his hip and let a few drops of water fall onto her mouth. Slowly, she swallowed. Her breathing steadied. The prairie wind whistled through the warped boards of the cabin. Elias glanced up at the gate again. The blood, the rope marks, the silence. This place was no gift of fortune. It was a curse sold cheap. And yet, as he crouched beside the girl, something stirred in his chest. A faint memory of his mother's voice long ago, reading from the Bible by lamplight after a hard day's work. "For when I am weak, then am I strong." 2 Corinthians 12:10. The verse rose unbidden in his heart. He had nothing left to lose, no place to call his own. Yet somehow this moment, kneeling in the dirt beside a dying Apache girl, felt like the beginning of something larger than himself. Elias tightened the knot of cloth around her throat, then looked once more at the land he had just bought for 12 cents. He thought he had purchased a cabin. What he had really bought was a war. Just that morning, the town of Liberty had gathered in front of the old courthouse. The air smelled of dust and horses, of sweat and tobacco, as men in wide hats and patched coats leaned against the rails. A faded flag drooped above the balcony. They had come not for a grand trial or a speech from the governor, but for something far smaller, an auction. The item was hardly worth notice to most. A weathered cabin, 12 acres of poor soil, a crooked barn, a well gone dry. Starting price, 12 cents. The auctioneer's voice rang out, half-hearted, as if embarrassed by the whole affair. The wealthier ranch owners didn't move. The traders with polished boots kept their arms folded. They all knew the place, Crow's Gate, as folks whispered. A patch of land with a history people didn't care to speak of out loud. Then Elias Turner raised his hand. His voice, hoarse from years of dust and whiskey, carried over the crowd. 12 cents. A ripple of silence passed through the gathering. Every eye turned toward him, not with envy, not even curiosity, but pity. It was the kind of look given to a man stepping into quicksand while everyone else stood safely on the shore. Elias felt it burning into his back as the gavel came down with a hollow thud. The cabin was his. He didn't smile, didn't tip his hat. He just adjusted the worn saddle strap over his shoulder and walked toward his horse. As he passed the church at the edge of town, the bells rang noon. The hymn from inside spilled faintly through the open door. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. And for a moment, Elias paused. He hadn't stepped inside a church in years, not since the war, not since the men he fought beside were buried without markers in fields now turned to dust. Still, the sound lingered with him as he mounted his horse. The dirt road stretched long and lonely ahead. The cabin lay 10 miles west, past the sparse woods and broken fences. Whispers followed him even as the hoofbeats carried him further from town. Poor soul, Crow's Gate will eat him alive. The sun dipped low as Elias rode, turning the prairie gold. He thought of the 12 cents, barely enough to buy a man a sip of whiskey. And yet it was all he had left. All that remained of years chasing cattle across empty plains, of scars carried home from battlefields no one remembered anymore. He wanted nothing more than a place to rest his bones. A cabin, a well, a barn, enough to keep a few head of cattle alive. A small corner of the world to fade quietly into. But as the trail bent, the woods grew silent. His horse stamped nervously. The gate appeared in the distance, leaning against tall grass, waiting. And, hanging from its beam, Elias drew his breath sharply, eyes widening. The 12-cent cabin had been sold as nothing more than rotting boards and a patch of dirt. But as he pulled the reins and rode closer, he saw the truth. It was not a home. It was a warning carved into wood and blood. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The rope snapped clean beneath Elias Turner's knife, and the body fell like a felled oak. The ground shuddered as she hit, forcing him to stumble back, boots sinking into the dry earth. For a moment he only stood there, staring. He had pulled cattle from mud pits and wrestled steers twice his weight, but nothing compared to this, the sheer force of her collapsing frame. The girl was enormous, shoulders broad as a blacksmith's, arms corded with muscle, legs so long they seemed made for running across endless plains. Yet now she lay twisted in the grass, chest rising in ragged bursts, each breath scraping like it might be her last. Elias knelt. His hands, calloused from reins and rope, pressed against her throat. The skin was raw and red, carved deep with the burn of the noose. Blood stained her lips, dust clung to her cheeks, but her eyes, dark, wide, burning, were still alive. She tried to move her lips, but only a broken sound came. "Easy," Elias muttered, tearing a strip from his own shirt. His voice rasped like gravel. "Hold on, girl, just hold on." He wound the cloth tight around her neck. His fingers trembled, though whether from strain or from the strangeness of it all, he could not tell. Here lay a woman built like no other he had seen, yet in his arms she was fragile, her life dangling by a thread. Her chest heaved, her eyes flickered open again. For an instant, fury burned in them, wild as fire in dry grass. Then it softened, turned into something else, a plea, a desperate cry without words. Elias fumbled for his canteen, uncorked it, and let a few drops fall onto her cracked lips. She swallowed weakly. He gave her more, watching her throat move, slow but steady. Relief seeped into his chest, though he hardly admitted it. The prairie wind whistled through the gate above them, the cut rope still swaying, creaking like a ghost's laugh. Elias looked up at it, jaw tightening. He didn't know who had done this or why, but he knew one thing. Someone had meant for her to die here, and someone would come back to see it finished. He had bought a cabin. Instead, he had stumbled into a curse. With a grunt, he slipped his arms beneath her and lifted. Her weight bore down on him, bending his knees. She was heavy as stone, yet he managed to drag her across the dirt to the cabin door. The hinges moaned when he pushed it open. Inside, dust lay thick, but the floorboards were solid, the stove still full of old ash. It did not feel like a place abandoned for years. Elias laid her carefully onto a wooden table, her breath rattling in the dim light. He pulled a worn blanket from a corner and draped it across her, tucking it around her shoulders. He studied her face. There was strength there, not just in the jawline and the broad cheekbones, but in something deeper, an untamed will refusing to let go. For a long moment, Elias stood over her, the silence broken only by her shallow breathing and the groan of the wind outside. This was not what he had wanted. He had hoped for a place to fade away, for a scrap of land to die on without notice. But here lay a life thrust into his hands, fierce and broken, demanding he make a choice. He remembered the verse his mother once read when he was still a boy by the lamplight. "The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble." Psalm 9:9. Maybe, just maybe, this moment was not an accident. Elias set his rifle within reach, then pulled a chair beside the table. He wasn't sure what storm he had stepped into, but for tonight he would stand watch. The fire in the cabin stove sputtered, throwing faint orange light across the walls. Elias Turner sat slouched in the chair beside the table, his rifle resting within arm's reach. He had dozed only in fits, ears tuned to every creak of the wood, every sigh of the prairie wind. The girl stirred. At first it was only a twitch of her fingers against the rough blanket. Then her eyes cracked open, black as obsidian and sharp even in weakness. She pushed a word through her torn throat, the sound low and broken. "Water." Elias leaned forward, lifting the canteen to her lips. She drank slowly, each swallow labored, then let out a ragged cough. For a moment the cabin fell quiet again. Elias thought she might drift back into sleep, but then she whispered something else, halting, each syllable heavy with effort. "Nayeli, White Hawk." The name struck him. He had heard it once before, at a fur trading post far north. They spoke of a girl from the White Hawk line, granddaughter of the Apache chief himself, tall as a man, stronger than most, a warrior bred in bone and blood. He had thought it nothing but campfire boasting. Now she lay before him. Elias studied her face, the high cheekbones, the wide brow, the set of her jaw that spoke of lineage older than the borders men had drawn across these lands. And something else, pride, even now, when her life clung by a thread. "You shouldn't be alive," he muttered, half to himself. Nayeli's eyes narrowed. She coughed, then forced the words. "They wanted me dead, for a message." Elias frowned. "Who?" Her head turned slightly toward the cabin gate outside, where the rope still swayed in the night breeze. "Traders, judges, men who steal land. They think killing me makes my people silent." Her voice broke on the last word, but her gaze did not falter. Elias felt a weight settle in his chest. He knew enough of history. Treaties written and broken, the Homestead Act twisted to strip tribes of their hunting grounds. But he hadn't expected to ride straight into the middle of it. "You're saying this wasn't random?" he said slowly. Nayeli's lips curled, almost a bitter smile. "Nothing is random. They watch." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Elias glanced toward the window slit, uneasy. Somewhere out there, he imagined eyes waiting, watching to see if their work had been undone. He turned back to her. For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. He wanted to ask why fate had tied him, a worn rancher, to her fight. But looking into her eyes, he found the answer wasn't hers to give. Instead, he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, rough hands gentler than he thought they could be. "Rest," he said. "You'll need your strength." She did not close her eyes right away. She kept staring at him as though weighing whether he could be trusted. Then, at last, her breathing steadied, and sleep claimed her once more. Elias leaned back in his chair, staring at the fire. Nayeli Whitehawk, granddaughter of Chief Whitehawk, was not a stranger fallen into his path. She was a spark thrown into tinder long set to burn. And if what she said was true, the flames would soon come. The fire in the stove burned low, its glow fading into ash. Elias Turner sat with his elbows on his knees, staring at the shadows on the wall. Nayeli slept fitfully on the table, her great frame wrapped in the blanket, breath uneven but steady. He rubbed a hand across his face. The rough stubble, the lines etched deep from sun and years, reminded him how far he had fallen from the man he once thought he'd be. War had carved the best years from him. He could still see it when he closed his eyes. The smoke rolling across battlefields, the sound of cannon thunder, the endless cries of boys who never saw home again. He had worn the gray of the Confederacy, a young fool swept up in promises of honor and land. What he found instead was mud, blood, and the weight of defeat. When the war ended, he rode west with nothing but a scarred horse and calloused hands. He drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to be remembered, never earning enough to matter. A ghost among men, working until his back broke and sleeping under skies that offered no comfort. And now here he was, cradling the life of a stranger in a cabin bought for 12 cents. Elias reached for his canteen again, took a sip of water that tasted of metal and dust, then let his gaze return to the girl. Nayeli Whitehawk, granddaughter of Chief Whitehawk, warrior-blooded, nearly hanged to death at the gate of this very cabin. He muttered under his breath, shaking his head. Why me? The question wasn't meant for her. It wasn't even meant for himself. It was meant for the silence that hung heavy in the room, the silence that felt older than wood or stone. His mother's voice rose unbidden from memory. She had read to him by lamplight, back in Tennessee, long before the war swallowed their farm and scattered their family. He could almost hear her now, soft yet steady. The just shall live by faith. Romans 1:17. Faith. He had lost it somewhere on the long march of years, lost it in the screams of dying comrades, in the dust of cattle trails, in the bottle that warmed him on lonely nights. Yet here, watching over a girl who should already be dead, he felt something stir again. Maybe Providence had led him here. Maybe the 12-cent cabin wasn't just bad luck. Maybe he was meant to be the hands that cut the rope, the one man stubborn enough to say, "Not today," when the world demanded silence. The thought unsettled him as much as it comforted him. He had no wish to be a hero. Heroes were the first to be buried. But he also knew he couldn't turn back, not now. Outside, the wind howled through the chinks in the cabin wall. Elias rose, walked to the door, and pressed a hand against it as though steadying himself against what waited beyond. The prairie stretched wide, and somewhere in that darkness, men with silver-rimmed hats and polished guns were watching, waiting. He turned back to the table. Natalie shifted in her sleep, a low groan slipping from her throat. Elias pulled the blanket tighter around her, then settled once more in his chair. For the first time in years, he whispered a prayer. Not for victory, not for land, but for the strength to do what was right, whatever storm might be coming. The prairie dusk was falling, the light thinning to gray. Elias Turner stepped onto the porch of the cabin, rifle in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. The wind had died, leaving the land eerily still, as though the whole world held its breath. That's when he saw him. A rider sat at the far edge of the woods, motionless atop a dark horse. The figure was too far for Elias to make out a face, but the silver trim of a wide-brimmed hat caught the last rays of the sun like a knife's edge. They stared at one another across the distance. Elias shifted his rifle, not aiming, not lowering. The rider didn't move, not forward, not back, just waiting, like a sentinel posted in the shadows. Then, as if the silent exchange had been enough, the man turned his horse sharply and vanished into the trees. Elias remained on the porch long after he had gone, the weight of that silver glint burning in his mind. Whoever that rider was, he hadn't come out of curiosity. He'd come to see whether the girl was still hanging at the gate, and now he knew she wasn't. Inside, the sound of movement broke the silence. Elias turned quickly, rifle still in hand. Nayeli Whitehawk was awake again. She had pulled herself halfway upright against the wall, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady, locked on his. "You saw him?" she rasped. Elias nodded. Rider in the woods, hat trimmed in silver. Her jaw tightened. "Fletcher Knox." The name meant little to Elias, but the way she spoke it made his stomach tighten. "Who is he?" he asked. Her lips pressed together as though even speaking of him cost strength. "A hound, sent by men who want me dead. By men who want this cabin burned to the ground." Elias said nothing for a long moment, his gaze flicking to the gate outside. The rope still swayed there, a grim reminder. "They will return," Nayeli whispered, her voice more breath than sound. Elias crossed the room, setting his rifle against the wall. He poured her a cup of water, then crouched beside her. She drank, her large hands trembling as she held the tin cup, but her eyes never left his. "They don't stop," she continued, each word clipped, deliberate. "Not until everything is ash." Elias felt the truth in her tone. He had seen men like that before. War had been full of them. Men who would rather scorch the earth than lose an inch of it. He placed a hand on the table beside her, steadying himself. "Then I reckon we'd better be ready." Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile, not quite despair. "You are only one man." Elias leaned back, the firelight cutting hard shadows across his face. "Sometimes one man's enough." Outside, the night was closing fast, the horizon bleeding into black. Somewhere beyond the woods, Fletcher Knox and his men were waiting, and Nayeli's warning gnawed at Elias like a splinter under skin. This was no longer about 12 cents. This was about survival. The next morning broke pale and cold. A thin mist rolled off the prairie, clinging to the cabin walls. Elias Turner tightened the cinch on his saddle, every movement stiff from a night spent half awake with his rifle across his knees. Nayeli stirred inside, still too weak to rise, her voice rough but clear enough to insist. "Medicine, clean water." Elias nodded. He had known it already. If she was to live, she needed more than rags and hope. He mounted his horse and rode the dirt trail back toward liberty. The closer he drew, the more the knot in his chest tightened. He knew how townsfolk looked at men who bought land cursed with blood. The bell above the church tolled once as he passed. He dismounted at the general store and stepped inside. Conversation died instantly. 3 women, bent over bolts of fabric, stopped their whispering. A pair of ranch hands froze mid-sentence. The storekeeper, a wiry man with spectacles perched on his nose, stiffened behind the counter. Every eye flicked toward Elias, then just as quickly away, as if afraid to be caught staring. Elias walked straight to the counter. His boots struck the floorboards with heavy finality. He pulled a few worn coins from his pocket, setting them down one by one. "Need bandages," he said. "Antiseptic if you've got it, and food enough for 2." The storekeeper's hands trembled as he packed the supplies. He didn't speak until the sack was nearly full. Then, in a voice little more than a whisper, he asked, "The cabin, was it Crow's Gate?" Elias gave a slow nod. The store went silent as a graveyard. Somewhere behind him, a spool of thread rolled across the floor, dropped from nerveless hands. Before Elias could answer, the back door swung open. Boots sounded against the planks. A man stepped inside, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a long coat of black wool. His hat brim was wide, its silver trim catching the dim light. The very same rider Elias had seen at the edge of the woods. Fletcher Knox. He didn't hurry. He didn't need to. His presence alone drew the air taut. Every soul in the store shrinking back as if his shadow carried weight. He stopped 3 paces from Elias, eyes cold as steel. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. With a flick of his wrist, he dropped it on the counter. It landed with a heavy thud, the unmistakable clink of coins inside. $500, he said. His voice was smooth, almost polite, but the edge beneath it was sharp enough to cut. That's more than you'll see in 3 lifetimes. Hand over the cabin tonight. The storekeeper flinched, dropping a jar of preserves. It shattered across the floor. The sound rang out like a gunshot in the suffocating silence. Elias didn't look at the pouch. He looked at Fletcher, square in the eyes. $500, he said slowly, for a rotting shack? You're not buying wood, you're buying something else. Fletcher's mouth curled into a smile that wasn't a smile at all. I'm buying your good sense, Mr. Turner. That cabin isn't for a man who wants to live long. The words carried like a death sentence. Elias's jaw tightened. His hand brushed the saddle strap over his shoulder, a subtle reminder that he was armed, though he didn't draw. Not for sale. For the briefest moment, the room held still. Then Fletcher tipped his hat, eyes never leaving Elias. Then you'll be seeing me again. He turned and walked out, the door slamming shut behind him. The silence left in his wake was worse than his presence. By the time Elias Turner returned to the cabin, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in streaks of copper and red. His horse snorted, uneasy, as they approached the gate where the rope still swung faintly. Elias dismounted, eyes scanning the horizon, half expecting Fletcher Knox's men to step out of the tree line. But the prairie lay silent, for now. Inside, Nayeli Whitehawk had pushed herself upright against the wall. She looked pale, her breathing labored, but her eyes followed him with a sharpness that cut through the haze of pain. "You came back," she said, her English halting but clear. Elias set the sack of supplies down, poured her a tin cup of water, and handed it to her. "Didn't figure I had a choice." She drank slowly, each swallow steadying her. Then she lifted her gaze, her voice carrying the weight of something deeper. "You should not stay. They will not forgive you for cutting me down." Elias leaned against the table, folding his arms. "I'm starting to gather that." Nayeli's hands tightened around the cup. "This cabin is not cursed, it is marked. Once it belonged to a white man, Samuel Hartwell." The name meant nothing to Elias. He frowned, and "He was different," Nayeli said. "He came to trade with my people. He learned our tongue. He saw papers, land deeds, forged, stolen, judges and governors selling ground that was never theirs. He found proof. He hid it." Her eyes flicked toward the floorboards, then back to Elias. "They killed him for it, hung me at the gate to keep us silent, to tell my people, 'Speak, and you will share his fate.'" The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier. Elias turned his gaze downward, tracing the cracks between the boards beneath his boots. He thought of the way the stove still held ash, the way the place felt too lived in for a cabin supposedly abandoned 15 years. "You think the papers are still here?" he said quietly. Nayeli nodded once. "They believe so. That is why they watch. That is why they will come again." Elias rubbed a hand across his beard, the scrape of stubble loud in the silence. $500 sat heavy in his memory, Fletcher's pouch of silver coins. Enough to buy him out of this fight, enough to vanish west and never look back. But then he looked at Nayeli, at the rope burns carved deep into her neck, at the bruises along her arms, the defiance that still burned in her eyes despite it all. She wasn't just another soul caught in the storm. She was the storm. Elias exhaled slowly. "So that's what this is. Not just a cabin, not just 12 acres of dirt. A graveyard of secrets." Nayeli leaned forward, voice low, urgent. "Not a graveyard, a fire. If the truth comes out, it will burn them all." The words settled into Elias like stones. He had never wanted a fight, never wanted a cause. But he could feel it now, pressing in from every side. The town's silence, Fletcher's threat, the eyes watching from the dark. The 12-cent cabin wasn't just his burden anymore. It was a battlefield, and he had already chosen his side the moment he cut the rope. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Night settled fast across the prairie, a velvet curtain pulled tight. The air grew sharp with cold, and every sound seemed to echo louder in the stillness. Elias Turner sat by the cabin window, Winchester across his knees, eyes fixed on the gate where a rope had swung just a day before. Nayeli stirred on the bed behind him, her breath ragged but steadier now. The fire in the stove had died down to embers, casting her shadow across the wall, a giant silhouette, even in weakness. Then the sound came. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, like a funeral drum. Elias straightened, heart hammering. Outside, torches appeared on the ridge, a line of fire moving against the dark sky. Riders, dozens of them. Their laughter drifted through the wind, low, cruel, echoing like wolves circling a wounded prey. At the head rode Fletcher Knox. His silver-rimmed hat glowed faintly in the firelight, his posture straight and calm, as though he owned the night. He reined his horse at the cabin gate, voice carrying sharp across the clearing. "Elias Turner," he called, "step out and talk like a man."
"That cabin ain't yours, and neither is what's inside." Elias rose, shoved the door open, and stepped onto the porch. He didn't hide the rifle, didn't raise it either. His eyes were steel in the flickering torchlight. "Bit late for a neighborly visit," he said. Fletcher let out a dry chuckle. "Last time I offered you $500. That offer's gone. What I want now is inside that house. Hand it over, and you walk away breathing." The men behind him shifted in their saddles, rifles glinting, eyes bright with the thrill of violence. From the doorway, a new shadow appeared. Nayeli. She had pulled herself upright, the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her towering frame filling the porch like a phantom risen from the grave. Her voice, rough but strong, rang out. "You tried to kill me, because I know the truth, but I am not dead." A ripple moved through Fletcher's men. Some muttered under their breath, uneasy at the sight of the girl they thought hanged. Fletcher's jaw tightened, though his smile never faltered. "Strong words for a dying wolf," he sneered. "Turner, she's dragging you into a bloodbath."
"Step aside, and I might let you keep your skin." Elias spat into the dirt, his grip tightening on the Winchester. "I paid for this cabin. It's mine, and anyone who lays a hand on this woman will pay in blood." The silence stretched taut, like a bowstring drawn to breaking. Then Fletcher's hand lifted, signaling his men. Gunfire cracked the night. Bullets tore into the cabin walls, splinters flying. Elias shoved Nayeli back through the doorway, slammed the door shut, and dropped behind cover. His rifle roared in reply, the shot echoing across the prairie. The siege had begun. The first volley of shots shredded the cabin walls, splinters flying like shrapnel. Glass jars on the shelf shattered, raining down sugar and flour. Smoke stung Elias Turner's eyes as he slammed a wooden table onto its side, dragging Nayeli down behind it. "Stay low," he barked, jamming another round into his Winchester. The gun roared, bucking against his shoulder. One of Fletcher's riders pitched sideways off his saddle, torch tumbling into the dirt. Shouts followed, curses and gunfire splitting the night. The cabin shook with every bullet. Holes punched through the boards, letting shafts of firelight in. Dust choked the air. Elias crouched, reloading with practiced hands, but he could feel the odds pressing down heavy. There were too many of them. Nayeli gritted her teeth, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. Her body trembled, not from fear, but from weakness, the noose burns still raw across her neck. Her gaze darted to the revolver lying on the floor near Elias. "Give it," she rasped. Elias turned, startled. "You can't." Her hand shot out, steady despite the tremor. "Give, now." For a heartbeat, he hesitated. Then he shoved the revolver into her palm. Her fingers closed around the grip like it was an extension of her own body. She dragged herself upright, leaning against the overturned table. Another volley rattled the cabin. A bullet tore through the wall inches above her head. She didn't flinch. Nayeli's eyes blazed, and she lifted the revolver with both hands. Her finger squeezed the trigger. The gun cracked. A rider fell at the very gate where they had strung her body like a trophy. His corpse collapsed into the dirt, blood soaking the ground beneath the beam that still bore her rope burns. For an instant, the night froze. Fletcher's men stared, wide-eyed, at the sight of the Apache girl alive, standing, shooting back from the cabin they had sworn to burn. A chill rippled through the line. Superstition whispered louder than bullets. Some swore under their breath that she was a ghost, risen to haunt them. Elias fired again, another rider dropping with a scream. He stole a glance at Nayeli, her chest heaving, her jaw clenched in raw defiance. "You keep shooting, girl," he muttered. "Make 'em believe you're death itself." She fired again and again, each shot deliberate, fueled not by strength but by will. Every bullet struck like a curse reborn, each echo hammering the message she would not die silent. Outside, Fletcher Knox bellowed orders, his voice sharp above the chaos. "Burn it down! Burn the cabin and bury them in the ashes!" Elias cursed under his breath, sweat stinging his eyes. He shoved more shells into the Winchester, his hands moving fast but never fast enough. The air inside the cabin grew thick with smoke and powder, each breath harder than the last. Nayeli's last round fired, hammer clicking on an empty chamber. She lowered the revolver, lips curling into something between a grimace and a smile. "They will not hang me again." Elias met her gaze. For a moment, amid the gunfire and the splinters, he felt it too. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a reckoning, and they were still standing. The smell of kerosene hit Elias Turner's nose before he saw it. Then the first torch sailed overhead, trailing fire, and crashed against the thatched roof. Flames leapt skyward. The cabin groaned as sparks rained down. Smoke curled thick, choking the air, wrapping the small room in a haze that burned the eyes and seared the throat. Nayeli staggered to her feet, coughing, the revolver empty in her hands. Her towering frame swayed in the firelight, the bruises on her skin glowing like brands. Yet her eyes held steady. "They will burn us alive," she said hoarsely. Elias jammed more shells into the Winchester, his movements fast, sharp, almost desperate. "Not if we make 'em pay first." The gun roared again, shattering the window pane as another rider fell outside. But there were too many, circling like wolves, torchlight flickering against their rifles. Another torch struck the roof. The dry straw caught quick, spreading faster than Elias could track. He could feel the heat already pressing down, sweat rolling down his face in thick streams. Nayeli leaned against the table, steadying herself. Her lips moved, almost too soft to hear. "If I die, my people lose their voice." Elias glanced at her, then back to the fire curling along the rafters. His jaw tightened. "Truth doesn't die that easy," he said. For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of fire and the pounding of hooves outside. Then a memory surged up in him, his mother's voice reading scripture long ago, words etched into his bones even after war had buried his faith. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." John 8:32. He spoke it aloud, his voice raw but steady, the words hanging in the smoky air like a challenge. Nayeli's eyes found his, dark and burning. Slowly she nodded. "They fear the truth more than they fear us," she whispered. The roof above them creaked, embers falling like red rain. Elias dragged another table across the floor, bracing it against the door. He set the Winchester down only long enough to shove a pistol into Nayeli's hands. "You're not dying here," he said, "not like they wanted. If this place goes down, we go down fighting." She wrapped her large hands around the pistol, her grip firm despite the tremor in her arms. Standing there in the blaze, her figure rose tall and unyielding, a warrior reborn from the noose they thought would silence her. Outside, Fletcher's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and mocking. "Set fire to every side! We'll smoke 'em out like rats!" Elias crouched low, rifle ready, eyes on the door. His chest burned with smoke, but his pulse hammered with something fiercer than fear. This was the line, the point of no return. If the cabin was to burn, then it would burn with their defiance carved into its ashes. The cabin roof cracked under the weight of fire. Flames clawed across the rafters, spitting embers into the smoky air. Elias Turner wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve, eyes narrowed against the sting. Every breath seared his lungs, every reload slower than the last. Nayeli stood beside him, pistol gripped tight, her silhouette towering in the firelight. Her voice was steady despite the chaos. "They will not take me alive." Elias spat into the dirt, chambering another round. "Then we die on our feet." Outside, Fletcher Knox bellowed, his voice rolling across the night like a judge pronouncing sentence. "Burn it to the ground! Leave nothing standing!" His men roared in reply. Torches flew, smashing against the walls. The blaze spread, orange tongues of fire licking across the cabin like a beast closing in for the kill. And then, a sound split the night, low, deep, rolling like thunder over the hills. The war horn. Elias froze, rifle halfway to his shoulder. Nayeli's head jerked up, her black eyes widening. For the first time since he'd cut her from the rope, there was fire in her gaze, not born of rage or pain, but hope. The horn blew again, followed by a chorus of cries that rose sharp and fierce, Apache war cries, echoing through the dark like the howl of 1,000 wolves. Shadows appeared on the ridge, not torches this time, but riders. Dozens, hundreds, the silhouettes of horses, spears glinting in the firelight, faces painted for war. Chief White Hawk's warriors, the full strength of a people wronged, had come. Fletcher's men faltered, some turned in their saddles, fear flashing across their faces. "Apache!" one of them shouted, his voice breaking. "The whole damned tribe!" Panic rippled through the line, rifles lifted, wavering as the Apache stormed down the slope. The ground shook beneath the pounding of hooves. Arrows whistled through the night, striking with deadly precision. A torchbearer dropped screaming, his fire scattering into the dirt. Another rider fell as a spear pierced his chest clean through. Elias ducked behind the window frame, staring out at the chaos. Relief surged through him, raw and wild. For the first time all night, they were not alone. Nayeli stepped to the doorway, her chest rising with ragged breaths, and let out a cry in the Apache tongue. The sound tore through the fire and smoke, a rallying call to her people. From the ridge, dozens of voices answered, fierce and unrelenting. Fletcher Knox wheeled his horse, silver-rimmed hat flashing. He barked orders, trying to hold his men together, but the fear was too strong. His mercenaries broke ranks, scattering under the weight of the Apache charge. Elias fired through the window, dropping a rider scrambling for escape. Then he looked at Nayeli, her figure framed in firelight, unbroken despite the burns, the bruises, the scars. "You were right," he said, voice hoarse. "They came back." She lowered her pistol, lips curving into the faintest smile. "Now the earth remembers." The war horn sounded again, long and triumphant, as Fletcher's men crumbled beneath the storm. Dawn crept slowly over the prairie, painting the sky with bruised shades of purple and gray. Smoke still curled from the cabin roof, though the flames had been beaten back with buckets of water carried by Apache hands. The ground outside was littered with bodies, men who had thought themselves wolves, now nothing more than carrion for crows. Elias Turner sat slumped on the porch steps, rifle laid across his knees, chest heaving with exhaustion. His face was streaked with soot, his hands raw from fire and recoil. He had seen battles before, but never one fought over a cabin worth 12 cents. Nayeli stood a few feet away, her shoulders squared despite the bandages around her neck and arms. She leaned heavily on the support of her people, but her gaze burned fierce as ever. Then Chief Whitehawk himself emerged from the crowd. His hair was long and silver, his eyes sharp as flint though lined with age. He embraced his granddaughter, holding her close, his voice low and rough. "The bloodline endures." Nayeli bowed her head, tears mingling with soot. For the first time, Elias saw the girl not just as a warrior, but as a child returned to family. Whitehawk released her, then turned his attention to the cabin. "This place hides something," he said. His voice carried the weight of certainty, as though truth itself had whispered it to him. "Hartwell died for it. We must find it before the enemy returns." Elias pushed himself to his feet, joints stiff. He stepped back inside the smoke-stained cabin. The air reeked of ash and powder. He walked slowly across the floor, eyes scanning the boards. Something gnawed at his mind. The stove still warm when he first arrived. The feel of the place too lived in for an abandoned ruin. In the center of the room, his boot tapped against a patch of wood that sounded hollow. He crouched, pressing his palm against the planks. The seams were sealed with a black resin, thick and unnatural. "Here," he called. White Hawk and 2 of his warriors stepped inside. With heavy axes, they struck the boards. The blows rang through the cabin, cracking the resin, splitting the wood. At last the planks gave way with a groan, revealing a dark hollow beneath. From the shadows, Elias pulled up a heavy iron chest, rust biting at its edges. The lock was brittle, breaking under the strike of a tomahawk. The lid creaked open. Inside lay scrolls, folded land deeds, government seals still marked in wax. Elias lifted one, eyes narrowing as he read the signature scrawled across the bottom: Judge William Crane. Another bore the bold stamp of Governor Marcus Webb. Nayeli leaned closer, her face hardening. "Forged," she said bitterly. "Sold our land to 10, 20 men at once. Hartwell saw, he tried to speak, so they silenced him." Elias thumbed through the pages. Payment ledgers spilled names, sheriffs, ranch owners, traders, all tied to bribes worth more than he could fathom. The weight of it pressed on him heavier than any rifle. White Hawk's voice rumbled low, almost a growl. "Now you understand. Fletcher was only the hound. The masters are Crane and Webb. They will not stop until this truth is ash." Elias closed the chest, jaw tight. He looked at Nayeli, then at the chief, then back to the scarred walls of the cabin. 12 cents had bought him wood and land, yes, but it had also bought him the burden of an empire's corruption. And now he held the evidence that could burn it all down. The storm did not wait long. By mid-afternoon, dusk rose on the horizon like a wall. The sound of hooves thundered closer, rolling like distant drums of war. Elias Turner tightened the strap of his rifle, standing at the cabin gate where the noose once swung. Nayeli stood beside him, her towering figure wrapped in fresh bandages, pistol at her hip. Behind them, the Apache warriors formed a line of horse and steel, spears glittering in the sun. Out of the dust emerged Judge William Crane. His black coat flared in the wind, his face hard as stone. Beside him rode soldiers under the banner of Governor Marcus Webb. Behind them stretched a column of militia, rifles raised, the force of an entire county. Crane halted at the gate, his horse pawing the dirt. His voice rang out sharp and commanding. "Turner, hand over the chest and the Apache girl. Do so, and you'll be spared. Resist, and this ground becomes your grave." Elias stepped forward. His boots crunched in the dirt as he raised the stack of papers high, letting the sunlight strike the seals and signatures. His voice, hoarse from smoke and battle, carried with iron steadiness. "These papers," he called, "bear your names, yours, Crane, and yours, Webb. Proof of every acre you stole, every bribe you took. This land isn't cursed, it's guilty, and the truth will hang you higher than any rope." Murmurs rippled through the militia ranks. Soldiers shifted uneasily, glancing at one another. Some spat into the dirt, doubt gnawing at their loyalty. Crane's jaw tightened. His voice cracked with fury. "Lies! That man is a drifter, a rebel! Cut him down!" Gunfire erupted. The Apache line surged forward, arrows streaking through the air. Elias dropped to one knee, Winchester kicking against his shoulder as he fired, felling the first wave of riders. Nayeli charged beside him, her pistol thundering, every shot a defiance against the rope that once marked her death. The field became a storm of dust, smoke, and blood. Horses screamed, men shouted, the earth itself trembling beneath the clash. Elias fought with a fury he hadn't felt since the war, not for land, not for pride, but for the truth clenched in his fist. Through the chaos, Judge Crane pressed forward, revolver drawn, his eyes locked on Elias. He raised the gun, ready to fire. But Nayeli was there first. Her massive hand struck his wrist, sending the pistol spinning into the dirt. Crane stumbled, sprawling at the gate. Elias loomed over him, rifle leveled, the stack of damning papers still in his other hand. His voice came low, like gravel grinding. "Justice comes, Crane, no matter how many cabins you burn." Crane's face drained of color as Apache warriors closed in, binding his hands with rawhide. Around them, Webb's soldiers faltered, some surrendering, others fleeing into the dust. At last, the field fell silent. The smoke drifted away, leaving bodies and broken weapons scattered like autumn leaves. Elias lowered his rifle. Beside him, Nayeli stood tall, her chest rising with exhausted pride. Behind them, the cabin still smoldered, but it had not fallen. What had begun as 12 cents of rotting wood had become a battlefield of truth and a grave for the lies of powerful men. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The prairie lay quiet at last. Smoke drifted over the field where men and horses had fallen. The sharp stench of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mingling with the bitter tang of scorched wood from the cabin's blackened roof. Crows circled high above, their cries carrying across the silence like a dirge. Elias Turner leaned against the porch post, his rifle hanging loose in his hand. His body ached from recoil and fire, from a night and day that felt stretched into eternity. Yet he still stood. Against every odd, he stood. Nayeli was beside him. Her towering frame cast a long shadow in the dawnlight, her skin marked with bruises and bandages, but her back unbowed. In her eyes burned a fire no noose could kill. From across the yard came Chief Whitehawk, walking slowly among the wreckage. His people moved behind him, gathering weapons, tending to the wounded, honoring their dead. The old chief's silver hair lifted in the morning wind, his gaze steady as it fell upon the cabin. He stopped before Elias, his face grave, but touched with something deeper, respect. This place was meant to bury truth, Whitehawk said. Now it has spoken it loud enough for the whole land to hear. Elias nodded, his throat tight. He looked down at the papers still clutched in his hand, the forged deeds, the names of judges, governors, ranchers, all inked proof of greed and betrayal. The very weight of it seemed heavier than iron, heavier even than the chest they had pulled from the floor. Nayeli stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "My people will not forget. Hartwell tried to speak, and they killed him, but now his truth is free." The words carried through the clearing, and the Apache warriors lifted their heads. They had come to fight for blood, but now they saw something more enduring, a chance for justice to echo beyond one night's battle. Elias exhaled, the breath rough in his chest. He thought of the man he had been only days ago, a worn rancher, a drifter with nothing left but a handful of cattle and 12 cents in his pocket. He had come seeking peace in a cabin. Instead, he had found war. And yet, for the first time in years, he felt the weight inside him ease. He remembered the verse he had spoken in the smoke and fire, words he once thought he'd never believe again. "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free." Perhaps freedom wasn't land, or cattle, or coin. Perhaps it was standing when the world tried to silence you. Perhaps it was fighting for something greater than your own weary bones. Nayeli's hand brushed the rope scar at her neck. She looked at Elias, her deep eyes steady. "They thought I would die here. Instead, I rise here, with you." Her words struck him harder than any bullet. For the first time in years, Elias felt something stir in his chest that wasn't bitterness or regret. It was purpose. Chief Whitehawk lifted a hand, signaling to his riders. "We will take these papers to the marshal. Webb and Crane will face judgment." His voice rumbled low, but resolute. "The land remembers, and now the law will remember too." Elias gave a slow nod. He glanced back at the cabin, charred, scarred, but still standing. Its walls bore holes, its roof smoked, but it had not fallen. Like him, like Nayeli. The noose that once swung at the gate was gone. In its place, Whitehawk's men hammered a rough wooden sign into the ground. Upon it, they carved a single word in both English and Apache: freedom. The wind carried the sound of the hammer strokes far across the prairie, each strike a promise that truth would not be buried again. And as the sun climbed higher, Elias Turner felt, for the first time in a long time, that perhaps God had not abandoned him after all. Years passed, and the prairie changed with them. Grass grew tall again where men once fell, swaying golden in the summer wind. The scars of battle faded, though the cabin still bore its wounds, bullet holes pocking the walls, black stains of fire across the roof. Yet it stood, as stubborn and weathered as the man who still sat on its porch. Elias Turner was older now, his beard silvered, his back bent with years of toil, but his eyes remained steady as he gazed across the land. The cattle grazed slow in the distance, the herd small but steady. He had not become rich, nor had he ever sought to. What he had gained was something far greater. Nayeli was there beside him. Time had not dimmed her presence. She remained tall and strong, though her hair carried threads of gray, and the rope scar still marked her neck like a brand of both pain and survival. Together, they watched the prairie as the sun dipped low, painting the horizon in red and gold. Where once hung a noose, a wooden sign now stood firm at the gate. Its carving weathered but unbroken: freedom. Travelers passing through often stopped to read it. Some whispered prayers, others left offerings, stones, feathers, tokens of remembrance. The cabin had become a place people spoke of with quiet reverence, a symbol not of death, but of justice reborn. Inside the cabin, the iron chest still rested in a corner, though its contents had long since been carried to the marshal, then to the courts. Judge Crane had stood trial, his crimes bared before the world. Governor Webb had fallen soon after. The empire of deceit had cracked and crumbled, undone not by armies or politicians, but by a rancher with 12 cents and the courage to cut a rope. Sometimes Elias thought back on that night, the fire and the smoke, Fletcher's laughter echoing through the dark. He thought of the moment he nearly laid down his rifle and walked away. And then he thought of the verse that had carried him through. The just shall live by faith. Romans 1:17. Faith. It was not always easy to hold on to. The years had taught him that. Yet every time doubt rose, he would look at the woman beside him, at the land stretching wide and untamed, and he would remember that God's hand often moved in ways a man could never foresee. Nayeli's voice broke his thoughts. The land is quiet tonight. Elias nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Too quiet, maybe. Reminds me of before trouble comes. She chuckled softly, the sound deep, worn with age, but still carrying the strength of her youth. Then let it come. We have faced it before. We will face it again. He looked at her, at the fire still burning in her eyes after all these years, and felt the same truth. Trouble would always return, in one form or another. Greed, lies, the hunger for power. But so would resistance. So would truth. So would faith. The prairie wind swept over them, warm and steady, carrying the scent of grass and dust. Elias leaned back in his chair, his calloused hands resting against his knees, and closed his eyes for a moment. Sometimes, he thought, a man spends his whole life searching for a place to rest. He had thought 12 cents bought him a shack to die in. Instead, it had given him something far greater, a reason to keep living. He opened his eyes, gaze falling on the sign at the gate. The word carved there had outlasted fire, bullets, and fear, and as long as it stood, so would the memory of what had been won. Nayeli reached over, her hand resting on his. No words were needed. The silence between them was filled with more than memory. It was filled with the weight of what they had endured and the quiet promise of what would endure after them. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the first stars pierced the darkening sky. Elias Turner sat back, breathing deep of the prairie night. The noose was gone, the fire had burned out. What remained was freedom. Out here on the prairie, where the wind still whispers through the grass and the stars shine as they did 100 years ago, we are reminded that the past is never truly gone. The struggles of Elias Turner and Nayeli Whitehawk are not just echoes of a distant time. They are reminders of courage, of sacrifice, and of the unyielding power of truth. Perhaps you, too, carry scars of battles fought long ago, losses endured, injustices witnessed, hopes tested by fire. This story is more than dust and gunpowder. It is about faith that endures, love that redeems, and the freedom that comes when ordinary souls dare to stand tall. If it stirred something in your heart, if it brought back memories of a world both harsher and simpler, then stay with us, subscribe, and walk with me again through true Wild West stories where history and humanity still ride side by side.